So we're going to be delving deeply into alternative fuels, and we've been very fortunate to be able to get 2 national experts and 1 local industry leader to be able to help us probe deeply. Are we going to be able to make progress? Are we going to be able to move significantly into this almost intractable area of really trying to make progress on alternative fuels? And I think even the critics talk about, if we do that, are we going to be doing it with indigenous fuels? Are we going to be doing it with locally produced fuels? So we want, and what else can we do to actually set the stage to be able to reduce the consumption of fuels in our transportation scheme? So I'd like to introduce the panelists who are joining me today. On the right, Aaron Kirk, who's Vice President of Hawaii Gas, and will be leading the charge with their efforts to look at renewable methane and other things in the marketplace and really implement these solutions. Lily Jonje, who is also familiar with Hawaii. She's sort of a nonprofit here called PICO, but she's here on behalf of the Rocky Mountain Institute. She runs their Renewable Business Center and looks at supply chain issues and will be able to give us some insight from that perspective. And Angelina Galateva, who's actually one of the board of governors of the California ISO, where all the action is, and at the state level, really handling these distribution issues and trying to figure out how alternative fuels can play an appropriate role as they become more and more renewable. So let me kick it off, with the mayor's broad proclamation. We heard about that in the last session, about going 100% renewable for ground transportation. What are some of the things that can be done today here in Hawaii, and what are some of the trends on a national basis as we try to pursue that path? So
I can get started. I mean, Hawaii, first of all, thank you very much for having me here. It's wonderful to be here. Eileen, Sarah, Sydney, and I'm very happy to be in Hawaii at the Verge Conference for the first time, and I've been very impressed with everything that's going on. And a lot of discussions have taken place in terms of how do we transition to 100% renewable energy. I'm on the board of the California ISO, and the California ISO is dedicated to transitioning to a carbon-free future. California has a goal of AB 32, which is 80% below 1990 levels in emissions, which means that the answer at the back of the book is, are we having a debate whether we're going to 50%, 60%, or 100% renewables in a context of AB 32? No. It's 100%, and not just in the electricity sector, but in the fuel sector as well. And in California, 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions are transportation related. So we have to tackle the transportation issue if we want to tackle the greenhouse gas emissions. It's not just the power plants, it's how can the power plants, how can the infrastructure, how can the ISO help support that transition to decarbonizing the fleets as well. And how do we all work together in unison to make it happen? It's the school districts, it's the fleets, it's the public transit, it's the individual drivers, it's also the fleet the operators in terms of the Ubers and the Lyfts. How do we create a charging infrastructure, not only for electric vehicles, which hopefully are going to be powered by 100% renewable energy, but also for hydrogen vehicles, which are also electric? How do we create that hydrogen? Do we use the excess over generation? Because as we transition to more renewables, there's a balancing issue. And some of you may have heard that in California, power is so cheap, it's almost free. And at times, we even have to pay people to take it. So if we can create a sink, and the transportation fuels become that sink that is able to absorb the really low cost or free power and create fuels that then are utilized in the transportation sector, then we've really crossed a milestone. And how do we transition to 5 million, 7 million vehicles on the road rapidly is maybe something that we're seeing the CCAs do, community choice aggregation, which is literally power to the people in the context of democratizing the grid, where municipalities and regions are basically banding together through their city councils and through their cities and saying, we'll provide those services. And Sonoma launched a program that buys down the cost of the electric vehicle. So you can actually be in an electric vehicle for brand new for less than $10,000. in Sonoma County, California. And they're also subsidizing or incentivizing the charging infrastructure as well. So these unique partnerships that are very new and that are evolving and flourishing are what is going to be, in my opinion, driving the decarbonization of the transportation sector. And Hawaii is ideal. The distances are smaller, it's much more compact, you have a lot of renewables, they're distributed everywhere. So electric vehicles penetration is already pretty strong. It can only get stronger as the price comes down. And I think the range anxiety isn't as sharp as it is in California, where people want to be able to drive to Las Vegas from LA without having to charge. So we have a bit of a problem. But we did work with Hawaii and an island in Brazil, Fernando de Noronha, and found a very interesting dichotomy because we had Chris Lee with us and Clay Murray from Onapolo, who basically said, well, why don't you electrify the transportation sector? Because the Brazilians were thinking of how do we go to 100% renewables on this really beautiful island that's very similar to Hawaii? And the answer was, well, you know, we have these really big hills and these really big potholes, so it's really difficult to have electric transportation. We need four-wheel drives. And the answer from Hawaii was very clear. Fix the roads, our hills are as big as yours, and yes, you can drive EVs here. So collaboration is extremely important, and I think Hawaii can play a huge leadership role for all of us in terms of lessons learned, deployment acceleration, and making sure that the mistakes that are made here maybe and in California are something we all learn from together so others don't have to repeat it.
You know, and we do find we do have some unique aspects because we're out in the middle of the Pacific. Not only do we have huge ground transportation, which most jurisdictions have that as part of their energy scheme, but we also have marine, about 10% of the transportation fuel mix, and aviation, which is equivalent to electricity, which is equivalent to the ground transportation depending on whether it's a busy travel year or not. And Lily, what are some of the supply chain issues and some of the other things that Rocky Mountain's been looking at when it comes to these other energy sources?
Thanks. Mahalo, Mark, and aloha to everyone. The Rocky Mountain Institute and the people I work with are the largest companies in the world, from Google to Dow to shipping companies and aviation companies. We also have cities. The city of Philadelphia is a BRC, a Business Renewable Center member, and they are all, the electrification problem is largely solved. It is an issue of transactions. The fuels and thermal problem is unsolved, and I must reiterate Commissioner's word that shipping and aviation, which is key to Hawaii and any island economy's growth and sustainability, needs to be addressed. At Rocky Mountain Institute, we pride ourselves in tackling the toughest problems. Nobody likes to talk about aviation fuel. Nobody likes to talk about the 1 million per week diesel that is going to Maui, and that's just Maui alone per week. And yet, those are the realities of the situation we face. So what can we do? One is, I do agree with Angelina, is there are pilot projects that you can collaborate. But I think there are better scaled solutions. And honestly, right now, the shipping and aviation industry are using carbon credits. Carbon credits that come from forestry in Costa Rica or whatever. But what we have now done is have a good traveler program where those credits go right into the fuel savings and efficiency to build out the shipping industry so they can get up to speed. So for example, how many of you sail out there or have sailed? A bunch. If you're local, you've already sailed. So the point is, if you just do a new coat of paint underneath the sailboat, the efficiency of that freight shipping is astronomical in terms of fuel savings. We're translating that into carbon emissions, and we're translating it to people who can buy those emissions, and it's called good traveler, as in you travel, you pay, and the industry can get up to speed. It is incremental change, but what I'm trying to say is until we can get fully electrified, which is another 10 to 20 years in these major industries, and Dow knows these things, we need interim solutions where the community can be involved.
Well, that's really insightful. I think a lot of people are wondering what is actually going on in the ground. I know there's been tests on various crops. Has that emerged into any real opportunities for scalable solutions? Aaron, can you give us any good news on what's going on?
I can, yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks to Verge for having me as part of this keynote, and thanks for having me not here at 8 a.m. 9's great, thanks.
We saved that for commissioners.
So one of the big initiatives that Hawaii Gas has been working on that my department is spearheading is the Renewable Natural Gas Initiative. We do have a pilot program currently in the works for growing biocrops, running the biocrops through anaerobic digestion to make biofuel that we can use in our pipeline. So from a transportation perspective, I've been in renewable energy for over 7 years now in Hawaii, and I really do believe in the electrification of transportation eventually, but there's two main cautions that I really want to throw out to everyone. Number one is the moving of emissions from the tailpipe to the power plant. It's not something that gets talked about often, but electric vehicles, they look very clean and they're very quiet, but if you're charging them with the grid, if you have solar on your house, and you're charging it during the day and your solar was sized just for your house load, then you have an extra load coming from coal and oil. This will be, eventually we'll be able to overcome this through 100% clean energy in Hawaii, but as of right now, we haven't. So when you are charging electric vehicles, it's 7 to 15% dirtier than a diesel vehicle, and that's because we're currently, to provide electricity, we're using coal and oil. So we just have to be cautious of that. Renewables need to be what's used to charge electric vehicles, not our standard grid. So that's the first caution I want to throw out. The second is resiliency. Electrifying everything is important, but part of the electrification of everything needs to be the stability of our grid. Stabilizing our grid means that it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when the next Category 3 or higher hurricane hits Hawaii. And we have dodged the bullet now for a long, long time. And when that happens, we will lose power poles. And when you lose power poles, you lose electricity transmission. And one of the key components to disaster recovery and resiliency is distribution of goods. We have to deliver diesel fuel to backup generators at hospitals, unless, of course, they're powered by natural gas, which is in a protected pipeline. That's a little plug, by the way, if no one picked up on that. But it's critical to deliver food and water. If everything's electrified, we have no power. So I truly believe in a holistic approach, especially, as Lily said, in the next 10 to 15 years, as we're overcoming a lot of the hurdles we have with our grid, with adding more renewables. So I'm advocating fairly heavily on what we can do right now. What we can do right now is we can do propane-powered vehicles. It's a very easy conversion from diesel. It's 50% cleaner. The NOx emissions and the particulate emissions are 95% less than diesel. It's not a forever solution, but it's a now solution. So, and the better solution is compressed natural gas. Compressed natural gas, we can convert a vehicle right now to compressed natural gas, and then through our renewable natural gas initiatives, we have a carbon neutral alternative to natural gas. So as we use the anaerobic digestion to produce gas, we can fuel vehicles that are compressed natural gas and have them carbon neutral.
So, I mean, in summary, you're a big advocate for energy diversity, not only in the electrical sector where we have to look at various renewable sources, but also as an energy system.
Absolutely. And I truly believe in a holistic approach to 100% renewable. And the main reason is spending 7 years or so in the solar industry, I really got to see a siloed approach where everyone was pushing their own technology, and solar was guilty of it, and I think every technology is guilty of it, as saying, hey, this is the only solution. But you butt up against problems that can be solved by other technology, whether it's storage, whether it's renewable natural gas. There are solutions out there, but we all have to work together and really use this holistic approach.
When I was energy administrator, we saw the difficulty in making progress on the original Clean Energy Initiative roadmap for transportation. And we had a reality check with a study 2014, 2015 by the International Council for Clean Transportation. It showed that, that Hawaii was woefully behind our projections on vehicle miles traveled, which was a key thing. I already mentioned average fuel efficiency, which is an executive office of the president and EPA issue primarily, and we've seen that rolled back, and that's a key element. But it led us to think that this transportation thing is requires a systems approach, and it requires new players. Could you address, do we need to have a whole different approach than this sort of the way we focused on electricity and a few key industrial players, and commission oversight of that to make real progress on our renewable portfolio standards? Systems approach, is that important?
It is important, and as was mentioned, it's extremely critical to have a holistic approach. It's not a one technology is the answer to everything. We actually ran a few scenarios for California, and if you go 100% solar, yes, it can be done, but it's very expensive, and it's not the highest value. So does the lowest cost necessarily mean that it's highest value in terms of a systems approach, especially when you're pushing beyond the 50%, 60, 70, 80%? You need to have a plethora of technologies that you're working with, and everybody needs to work together, and the grid needs to be the highway that everybody can participate in and can drive on as long as they follow the rules and are good grid citizens, as Commissioner Hochschild mentioned earlier. So being able to integrate solar, being able to integrate distributed solar and large-scale solar. Geothermal is very important. That's 24/7 availability. Renewable gas is critical. There's another infrastructure that you can use as storage or you can use as generation as well that adds to the resiliency. Wind power is important, biofuels are important. Making sure that you're breaking down the silos that can actually happen between not only the transmission and distribution system, but allowing vertical integration all the way to the customer's meter. And you're taking that storage that may be behind the meter with the customers, coupled with their solar system and their charging infrastructure, and utilizing it as grid services and grid support, which is extremely important. And then what are the market mechanisms that you can send so you can monetize those services? Because if somebody invested in a solar system, storage, and electric vehicle, and we are using it for grid support, we should be able to pay them and compensate them. So all of a sudden, the consumer, who now is the prosumer, is becoming very active in saying, well, wait a minute, I want to be a part of this energy future. Why can't I monetize an asset that I could never monetize before and participate in it? So again, a systems approach, as we take all of these elements on the distribution grid, on the large-scale transmission grid, we integrate them together, and we actually dispatch them to be able to balance a grid not only vertically, but geographically as well with our neighbors. So having a larger footprint and being able to incorporate that larger footprint with the distribution network is extremely critical for us. So the systems approach is important. You're taking transportation, supporting the energy grid. You're taking natural gas and the gas infrastructure and utilizing it as a storage technology through hydrogen and renewable gas. Even our German colleagues are using their grid infrastructure and saying, you know what, you in California invest in batteries and give us the experience with batteries. What we're going to be doing in Germany and in Europe is making hydrogen. We're pumping the hydrogen in the grid, and guess what happens? We've got an integrated renewable grid from northern Germany all the way to southern Italy, and we can push the renewables via the pipe network. And that's what they're investing in as well. And we think that that's important for us also, because resiliency is critical. You need the local resiliency, you need the statewide resiliency and the regional resiliency. we're in an earthquake zone. We've got fires. We've got vulnerable infrastructure. So how do we make sure that this much more complex system that is no longer unidirectional from the utility to the customer and you take whatever price they give you, but is now bidirectional where customers are selling back, aggregators are coming in, CCAs are popping up and saying 50% isn't enough as an RPS goal, we're going to 100, and they're doing it now, cheaper than what the utilities are doing. And this has accelerated to the point of where there are predictions now that CCAs will be serving over 80% of the load in California. And they're integrating the distribution network with the transportation and making sure that it all works together. I mean, aviation and shipping is a separate issue that we can talk about as well, but it's if we can tackle the transportation system on the ground, along with the charging infrastructure, along with the distribution and distributed energy management networks in DER, as well as integrate the grid and make sure that all power is valued appropriately and have this large systems approach, it makes us much more resilient and much more secure.
Well, you know, declining cost curves have really, and thank you for driving the market. You know, California's been doing such an outstanding job in the electricity sector, and obviously the distribution networks and the whole electricity grid have been really driving markets throughout the United States, and we're a benefactor. Thank you for that. Are there other lessons? When we see the declining cost curves in the renewable space, we don't see that yet in the alternative fuels. Is there any reason for optimism that we're going to catch that? Is that going to be one of those things that when we heard the talk yesterday about what are going to be the undefined things of the future, or is this one of the potential breakthroughs?
The good news is what I said before, electrification, it's a solvable problem. We've been doing EV to grid studies with here in Hawaii for a while. Flexibility of the grid, peak shaving, all of those, we know them. The highest and best opportunity is still in the industries we cannot touch. Aviation, shipping, transportation is instrumental to Hawaii's economy because of tourism. Simply alone, all of us that are not from here flew here. And along those lines, that fuel in itself has to be, have solutions. But instead of focusing on the supply side, what we have been able to do is harness the demand. The power of the prosumer, the power of the consumer is extremely important. And 50 airlines, over 50 airlines know this, over 100 airports know this, and over hundreds of cities know that they need to address large infrastructure systems. So I have actually a lot of optimism in solving the problem, not from the supply side and not from the technology side, but from the consumer side. Because if the consumer wants it, and we've had experience with from Google to Apple to enable 9 gigawatts of new renewable power in 3 years. On the fuel side, it's about cost competitive prices, but it's also about demand choice. The choices you make when you travel, when you can do a good travel program. There is still so much upside on fuel efficiency that we can do to ensure that aviation and flying here to Hawaii and sustaining the tourism can pull the changes we need. And honestly, if the tourism industry moves here, and I know this afternoon's session will be very important to that, I think that will be a huge investment in the fuels area and the transportation area.
Well, I'm glad we were able to end this session on a positive note. I'll tell you that the time at 25 minutes just flew by, but I really want to thank each of you for joining us and enlightening us on what we might be able to see in alternative fuels. One of our renewable energy leaders and now leading executive at Hawaii Gas. Thank you, Aaron. Lily, thanks for coming, and Angelina.